you've been watching special coverage of the January 6th committee's 9th public hearing. The panel took what it describes as the serious and extraordinary action of voting to subpoena former President Trump.
We also saw new video of how former Vice President Mike Pence, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer responded as the attack unfolded. Joining us now from the nation's capital is CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. And here with us on set, we have CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe and former Secret Service supervisory special agent and CEO of Sentinel Security Solutions, Charles Marino. Major, I want to start with you. Major headline, that unanimous vote coming out of the committee there to subpoena former President Trump. We heard the committee chair, Benny Thomas, say that that is an extraordinary move, but that Trump bears responsibility for and, quote, accountability to the American people. We also heard Congresswoman Cheney play testimony of Trump confidant Roger Stone, General Michael Flynn, Trump lawyer John Eastman, top justice official Jeff Clark, all of them taking the fifth as part of the reason why they needed to hear from Mr. Trump directly. What's your reaction?
So the committee is putting before the entire country this question. Do you want to hear from former President Trump about what he did and, importantly, what he did not do on one of the most fateful days in American history, January 6, 2021? And the president could say, I'm not going to recognize the validity of this select committee. Good luck. Others have tried that. Federal courts have authorized and essentially validated its ability to issue subpoenas and compel testimony. So the former president can put this off, say it's an illegitimate committee, but that legitimacy has already been established by federal courts who have reviewed the underlying suggestions that it's not, procedurally and otherwise. This will also put before the midterm elections, again, the question of former President Trump's culpability for everything before, during, and after January 6th, and ongoing. So it has a legal dimension, it has a congressional investigatory dimension, and it quite obviously has a political dimension. But let me say one thing that's really important about what we saw today. The video of those members of Congress in the leadership positions, Republican and Democrat, huddling together, is an unexpected movie showing a very important plot line. What is that plot line? For the first time in American history, we now have video evidence of an attack by the executive branch on the legislative branch. What we saw was leaders in Congress trying to marshal resources from neighboring governors and the Pentagon outside of their direct authority. Why? Because they were under assault. Who was the assaulting party? The executive branch of the United States government. We've never seen it before. We saw it in a macro sense externally in the United States Capitol, but that collection of congressional leaders under duress trying to figure out a way not only to reconvene, but to protect themselves and repel a violent mob. They were doing so because they were under assault by the executive branch of our government. We should never forget that.
Major, when you and I spoke around this time yesterday, you were emphatic that when I said, well, these things tend to seems as if it's designed for television, you had said, no, this is designed for television. This committee knows exactly what it's doing. And even if you think, okay, if folks aren't following the legal details, just watching that video itself was pretty compelling. I read O'Keefe reporting that it was recorded by Speaker Pelosi's daughter, Alexandra Pelosi. For our viewers, let's just show a portion of what you've just laid out and what they showed for the first time today, and we'll speak about it on the other side.
Governor Hogan, but I still think you probably need the okay of the federal government in order to come into another jurisdiction. Thank you.
Secretary of the Army.
Oh my gosh, they're just breaking windows. They're doing all kinds of. It's really that they said somebody was shot. It was just horrendous, and all at the instigation of the President of the United States.
Let me bring in Charles Marino, our Secret Service expert, to react to that. What were you thinking watching that? And help us understand the security posture around the Capitol and why there are still these open questions about why more wasn't done ahead of time.
Yeah, a lot to review here. Obviously, the threat environment was elevated based on the political rhetoric coming from former President Trump. He was the main instigator here in raising the temperature domestically here in the United States causing all of these types of actions. We've got several agencies, their actions under review. The Secret Service, what role the Department of Defense played, the Department of Homeland Security, and let's not forget about the FBI, which is the lead domestic intelligence agency here. So what role did they play? The big question is, how was the Capitol able to be overrun that day? Why didn't everybody get the intelligence? And if they did get the intelligence, why did they not understand the intelligence and take action in response to that intelligence? Action is faster than reaction. You hear Speaker Pelosi calling for reinforcements, especially when your reinforcements aren't on site. That's not going to work. That's not going to give you the robust security posture that you need even to respond to a situation like this. So I think the security planning of the U.S. Capitol Police has to be looked at because they were technically set up to fail. They report to the Senate Sergeant at Arms, the House Sergeant at Arms, the Chief of the Capitol Police. We'll remember all three of those individuals resigned following the January 6th attacks. So there's a lot more questions here. But, you know, following the attacks of September 11th and the billions of dollars that were spent in response to those intelligence failures, the creation of departments and agencies and reorg of the intelligence operation here domestically, this needs to be looked at and looked at closely because I don't think we got all the answers we need today.
Rebecca, I want to get you to weigh in on two of the things that stuck out from what Charles just said, that the Capitol Police were set up to fail and that the former president was the main instigator. One of the most powerful moments was actually seeing those at the Capitol respond to Trump's video, telling them to go home. We can clearly hear them say, "That's our order. That's our order." How culpable is the former president if the people who were there perpetrating this attack on the Capitol felt like they were responding to his orders?
Right. So, I mean, there are a couple of different questions. There's a question of moral culpability and there's a question of criminal culpability here. And I think when you talk about criminal culpability, you're really talking about the state of mind, the intent of the accused. And so if we're thinking about what was the president's state of mind, in a way you could say, well, how the crowd reacted doesn't really tell us what was in his mind. But all the time, prosecutors use that kind of evidence to show what the president, what the person that they're targeting must have been thinking. If you see somebody responding that way to an order, then there's an inference there that the person who gave the order should know what power he has with regard to those people. So why did he not call them off earlier? Is
there a bright line, though? If he didn't say, go attack Mike Pence, but his followers thought that they were receiving an order from him, does he face a legal responsibility?
So if there were legal responsibility, criminal liability here, you would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what his intent was. Now, you can prove that through circumstantial evidence. All the time, we prove criminal intent through circumstantial evidence because very rarely does somebody say, hey, this is what I mean to do. And one of those key pieces of evidence would be what ultimately happens. And so what we saw here would be powerful evidence of what the president was thinking beforehand, because we can draw the inference if this is what ultimately happened, he must have known that he could call them off at any minute. He did not do that. Why did he not do that? It is because he did not want to.
Which is likely why they laid out the president's tweets in real time, showing that his comments about Vice President Pence then led to them looking for him while he was hunkered down in the Capitol. I want to get back to this, what the Secret Service knew and what they should have done topic. Let's show some evidence the committee presented showing that the Secret Service knew about the potential for real violence that day. Let's watch.
The Secret Service was aware of weapons possessed by those gathered at rallies in D.C. as early as the evening before. Take this document, for instance, which details multiple arrests in the crowds demonstrating on January 5th. Those arrests were for weapons offenses, handguns, high-capacity feeding devices, ammunition. What the Secret Service saw on the 6th was entirely consistent with the violent rhetoric circulating in the days before the joint session.
Charles, what does that tell you based on your experience? If that intelligence is available and actionable, what questions are still on your mind?
Yeah, I think there's some more questions for the Secret Service. Obviously, I break it down into 3 areas. The event down at the Ellipse where the former president spoke, the attempted trip by the president, the OTR, the off-the-record movement to the Capitol, and then the protection activities regarding Vice President Pence. That's the way I break down the Secret Service's activities that are of focus that day. And were they operating off of the latest intelligence and taking appropriate actions? I think where you see the issues that's being raised is the event that took place down on the Ellipse, where outside of the secure perimeter, there were people that were armed, right? Which is a violation of D.C. law. You can't bring firearms and weapons in there. And you also, just because it's on the outside perimeter, do not want people to have weapons at an outside event while the president's speaking. So what did the Secret Service do in response to that to mitigate that threat specifically? That's the information I think we need. And then we know about the failed trip to the Capitol, and we know what the protection detail was doing with Vice President Pence down at the Capitol. And I'll finish. Let's not forget, we had a serious threat to the continuity of our government at the Capitol that day based on the main players and leaders that were present for the certification of the election.
And when we spoke earlier, you were wondering why they didn't make the Capitol a special security zone, as has been done for inaugurations, and would have alleviated some of the very things you're bringing up.
That's often really common, right?
Well, look, that's right. And that's where the role of the Department of Homeland Security needs to be looked at. And there was some politicization there regarding the steps that they took to make sure that the event went off seamlessly. But they could have dedicated resources to that event by declaring it a national special security event, which would have put the Secret Service in charge of the planning that day. We see it for the inauguration. We see it for the State of the Union. You have similar players that were at the Capitol that day. So why, especially based on the elevated threat that we were talking about, was that event not made an NSSE?
If you are just joining us now, we are discussing our special coverage of the January 6th committee's 9th public hearing. At this committee meeting, they took an extraordinary step of unanimously voting to subpoena former President Donald Trump. We are joined by Major Garrett, Rebecca Roiphe, and I want to continue with you,
Charles Marino as well.
Charles Marino,
Happy to have him.
who just answered the last question. But I was so anxious, I guess, to turn to you, Rebecca, and to talk to you about some of the video that we also saw. In particular, the video of Cassidy Hutchinson testifying that the former president was irate when he couldn't march on the Capitol with his supporters. Committee member, the committees said that they have evidence corroborating that. I want to play a little bit of that sound, please.
The committee is reviewing testimony regarding potential obstruction on this issue, including testimony about advice given not to tell the committee about this specific topic. We will address this matter in our report.
So how important is it for the committee to demonstrate the former president's mindset heading into January 6th? Because we've been talking a lot about mindset. And Charles, I also want to get you to weigh in a little bit about how this may have eroded some of the feeling about our public institutions, particularly the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Rebecca, why don't you go ahead and start?
So I think that this is critical to the question of mindset or intent or what it is that the former president meant to do on this day. Because at this point, we've now had all of these different pieces, puzzle pieces, and each one of them suggests what he knew. And that's what we use to put together what somebody intends, right? So we know that he knew in many ways that he had lost this election and nonetheless both acted as if and said publicly that he won. Now, that is damning, right? And then you add to that he knew there was danger that day. He knew people were armed, and he knew that he must have been apprised of all of those Secret Service messages about what the level of danger was. And then if he was then going to steer right into that, that would be a very important piece of evidence, both that, if you were trying to prove that he was, intending to obstruct an act of Congress, that he was intended to do what he actually did. And so I think we really need to figure out, or the committee would really want to figure out, what actually happened there. And so what they're saying is that we are going to pursue this question, possibly because we've gotten conflicting reports, but also, in addition, we've gotten some sense that there might have been some effort to meddle with people's testimony. And that will be incredibly relevant to putting together both what happened that day and what the former president intended.
And we want to dig in more on that. But Charles, I just want to give you an opportunity to comment as well, because part of this discussion is really about the Secret Service and them, in some places, banging heads with their commander-in-chief. How does the Secret Service come out reputationally on all of this?
I think you're seeing all the agencies involved in this take a hit, and it's taking a hit of their credibility and their capability to perform their jobs. And I think, simply put, what we see here is we see all these agencies which fall under the executive branch were undermined by the leader of the executive branch.
Incredible.
Unbelievable, right? So the last thing you want to have is the sitting president of the United States undermining the very institutions that are responsible for safeguarding the country.
Major, let's bring you in to discuss that point, because certainly it's likely not something we have discussed before when covering any executive branch. We do want to report that Benny Thompson, the chairman of the committee, now has said there will be no subpoena for Vice President Pence. But considering they've now unanimously voted to subpoena President Trump, to what end? We know the president is defiant. He's boisterous in this position. If he shows up and pleads the Fifth, what's the benefit there? Spin that out for us.
Well, look, the committee has to establish, for not only history, but for the American public watching it closely, that it has taken every step imaginable to obtain all the evidence obtainable. Subpoenaing a former president checks that box. And as several of the committee members said, former President Trump is the central actor and central to this entire story. So to not subpoena the former president would have been an enormous void and would have invited criticism like, well, if you're so serious about this and it's so important, where's your subpoena for the former president? So it's answered that question. But let me just go back to what Charles mentioned a second ago. Let's just put a couple of key facts together. Yes, we learned today about more information than we knew before about what the Secret Service had a reasonable suspicion might be present on January 6th in terms of danger, weapons, and the like. There's other streams of information through the FBI and others that probably should have filtered up to the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police side of this question is its own to defend. But on the rest of the executive branch, as Charles got to, let me just bear down on that a little bit more. Right now in Washington, D.C., a separate trial is going on charges of seditious conspiracy. One of the defendants, through his attorneys, has said those defendants were awaiting an order from the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would have deputized them to storm the Capitol to stop the steal of the election. If they had a reasonable belief that the president of the United States was going to issue that insurrection decree, might you not question what that executive branch would have done with all this information about potential threats to the Capitol? This goes to the very heart of what the executive branch was doing or not doing, which is why I believe I have accurately characterized this from the very beginning. A premeditated attack by the executive branch on the legislative branch. One other key detail. In testimony today, it was made clear that when Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, was on the phone with former President Trump, then President Trump, on January 6th, President Trump's first reaction was to say, Kevin, those aren't my people, that's Antifa, meaning leftists who fight fascists in America. Kevin McCarthy said, no, Mr. President, they're your people, they're attacking my staff, and we are afraid, words to that effect. To which the former president, then president at the time, immediately changes his perspective on this and says, okay, they are my people. And they're more angry than you are, Kevin. So even that idea that it was some other force lasted for about 5 seconds. And one conversation with Kevin McCarthy, the president confirms that he knows they are his people. And he doesn't care. Furthering the evidentiary basis of state of mind, knowledge, and acceptance of the crime that was going on before not only his eyes, but the bewildered, astonished eyes of not only this country, but the rest of the world.
And Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler there, her testimony saying that was chilling for her to hear the president say as much in that exchange. Charles, let's bring you in on that topic then, to the questions Major's just asked. Who in the executive branch, who in the White House can answer that? And
if I may, Charles, I also want to tack on, I'm struck as we're sitting here talking to you, watching your face react to some of this and watching the faces of those law enforcement officials there in the front row of the hearing room. All of you have vowed at one point or another to put your life on the line for this country. How has all of this sat with you?
Well, it's disheartening, right? I mean, you go out each and every day, as the Capitol Police, Secret Service, and all the other agencies went out that day to do, and they're being undermined by the leader of their very government, who's stirring up all these right-wing extremists, which are very dangerous, articulated as being armed, articulated through open source social media platforms as wanting to storm the Capitol. I don't want to hear that the President of the United States at the time is the one leading the charge. You're causing injury to the very people that have taken an oath to safeguard the country and protect certain institutions. And as Major said, here you had the executive branch attack the legislative branch. But most of the agencies in the law enforcement community fall under the executive branch. So you have the government basically turned within itself.
And so who then in the White House would be able to answer the questions that we've been throwing out?
We've got a lot of questions, and I think it's depending on who in the White House played a certain role. I think ultimately the buck stops with the president here. You cannot have right-wing extremist groups with the phone number to the White House and have missed calls. That's not supposed to happen unless it's the main switchboard, which is a publicly available number. We're not talking about that. There was a relationship here with right-wing extremist groups. And we've got a lot going on in the judicial system with respect to that, so that there's a lot more information that will come out on that front of it. But I think we're going to find, and the committee alluded to it, I think we're going to find a lot of different people in the administration play different types of roles throughout this process and leading up to the day.
Rebecca, anything we heard today that gives you confidence that the former president may face some type of charges?
You know, I really don't know that, because that decision rests with Merrick Garland, and there are so many different considerations beyond just what the evidence shows about whether or not to make that decision. I mean, even if there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, there's another question, which is it in the public interest for the Department of Justice under one administration to bring a criminal charge against the former administration, the head of the former administration? That's a huge and unprecedented thing that would take a toll. So I'm not sure about that. I will say one thing about the subpoena to the former president, which is at the very end, when they showed all that testimony in a criminal case, you cannot draw an inference that when people plead the fifth, that means that they are somehow guilty. But this is not a criminal case. So that leaves us all watching, thinking, why did all of these people so close to the former president plead the fifth? And that is a reasonable thing for us to conclude in this context. Why did they?
Major, I'm told that we have to go, but very quickly, I want to know if you think that this is going to change any minds or merely re-entrench existing beliefs.
I think it will probably re-entrench existing beliefs. There are those in the Trump wing of the Republican Party who don't want to look at this story, can't bear to look at this story, and will do everything they can to pick apart aspects of it to defend their position. The rest of the country learned more today. It has learned it persistently all summer long, and there is evidence that independent voters looking on this are aghast and may vote accordingly in the midterm. I'm not sure that changed much today, though.
All right. Major Garrett, Rebecca Roiphe, Charles Marino, thank you all.